Now, if you go on in the Passover story, you'll see that God instructed the people to continue to celebrate the Passover. This wasn't the end of it. They were to each and every year tell the story of what God had done for them in ancient Egypt. And it particularly says to tell the story to your children. We all know that children learn best, and I guess we all do. If you don't only hear the story with your ears, but what if you're able to see the story? How about tasting, touching, and smelling the story? Well, that's why Passover is today celebrated in a very sort of graphic and visceral way with this Passover meal. The most famous Passover meal ever celebrated was the Last Supper. Every single year in the earthly life of Messiah Jesus, as a Jewish boy growing up in a Jewish home, he would have celebrated Passover, just as the scriptures command the Jewish people to do. He would have watched with eyes wide open as his stepfather, Joseph, officiated over the Passover for the family there in Nazareth. In later years, Joseph seems to be out of the picture. Perhaps he was considerably older than Mary. In that instance, it would have been Jesus himself, as the eldest son in the Jewish family, who would have officiated over the Passover there for the family. Then we come to the last final year in the earthly life of Messiah, where once again he celebrated the Passover, but this time with those 12 disciples in the upper room in Jerusalem. And of course, that famous Jewish Passover Seder is recorded in Christian literature. So the most famous Jewish Passover service ever celebrated winds up being the Last Supper, which was a Jewish Passover Seder. In the Last Supper, there would have been a plate in the middle of the table. Not as ornate as this one, because in the 2,000 years since Messiah Yeshua celebrated the Passover, there have been a few items added, maybe one item added for sure, but even by his time, there were some items added since the time when God originally commanded the observance of Passover. But in most Jewish homes, they would have a plate just like this, but this would be sitting flat on the table. In each one of these areas, there would be little glass bowls, and those glass bowls would be containing the various food items that are used to symbolically illustrate the story of Passover. For instance, we had talked about the hyssop dipped into the blood in ancient Egypt. In this instance, they would have a sprig of parsley that is used to represent the hyssop and to facilitate the telling of the story. But they'll take the sprig of parsley and dip it into salt water, and then as they taste the salt water, the idea is that you are symbolically tasting the saltwater tears that were shed by our Jewish people as they labored in bondage there in Egypt. So each one of the parts of the Passover celebration has a narration, some sort of story to tell in relation to the Passover. But for most people, of course, the central items of the Passover would be the unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine. The unleavened bread is presented in a manner just like this. I have here what do we call in Yiddish? Yiddish is the language of my grandparents, and I grew up hearing a lot of Yiddish. But what we have here is called in Yiddish a matzah tash, or literally a matzah holder. And this one happens to have been made in Jerusalem. Some matzah tashes are square, some are round, but they all have this wording. At the top there in Hebrew it says, Likvod Chag HaMatzot, in honor of the holiday of unleavened bread. So no matter whether it's large or small or round or square, all matzah tashes have two sewn-in dividers, if they are cloth matzah tashes, and in each of the sewn-in compartments is a sheet of unleavened bread. So remember, this matzah tash, it's not like a trick matzah tash. It's not anything that I just made up for this demonstration. But this is one that you can purchase in any Orthodox Jewish religious goods store. So there are 3 sheets of matzah, and they're all held together as one single unity. At the beginning of the Passover Seder, the rabbi or whoever else is officiating will go into the matzah tash, bypass the first matzah, not go all the way to the third, but he reaches in and withdraws from the unity of the 3 in 1. The 3 matzahs held together as a single unit. He withdraws the middle matzah from the unity of the three. He'll hold up the matzah so that all those at the table can see that the matzah that we're using is matzah that is indeed kosher Pesach, kosher for Passover use. Then he'll take the sheet of matzah and he breaks it in half, more or less. They never break completely in half. Then he'll take a white cotton cloth, okay, and according to Jewish tradition, you take 1/2 of the broken body of the middle matzah, and now that is wrapped in this white cotton shroud. Okay? So you take a white cotton shroud, you wrap the broken body of the matzah, and now, according to Jewish tradition, this must be buried under something out of sight. So oftentimes they'll hide it someplace in the room, or sometimes put it on the table underneath the matzah tash. But I just need to have you understand why Passover matzah is so unusual and so special. The rabbis say that Passover matzah can be made round. Sometimes you'll see shmura matzah, which is large, round matzah, handmade. Sometimes the matzah is square and machine-made like this. However it's fashioned, whatever its size, there are only 4 absolutes about the Passover matzah. Here are the only 4, and by the way, this comes from the authoritative Jewish book of Jewish laws and rules and regulations, and that is the Talmud. In the Talmud, in a book called Tractate Pesach, here are the 4 rules that they say about Passover matzah. Number 1, it has to be unleavened. If you look at the matzah, you'll notice, of course, it's flat. It's not risen at all. There's nothing to make the matzah rise. The only ingredient in Passover matzah is flour and water. They take flour, and plain water, and it's baked with just that. That's why you wind up with a flat cracker like this. There's no yeast, there's no baking soda, there's no leavening agent, nothing to make the matzah rise. The reason for that is that when the Jewish people left Egypt, they left in haste. There was no time to, like bake a nice pumpernickel bread or something. That's what I would want if I was going on a trip. I wouldn't want this. In the scripture, this is called lechem aniyah, the bread of affliction, or literally the bread of the poor. So this is what we eat for 8 days to remind us that our ancestors had to leave Egypt in haste, and they had to eat the bread of affliction. So the first is that the matzah is unleavened.